Off today with news on Russia and, of course, this letter leaked to the Spanish press, and it contains the response from NATO and the U.S. to the Russian security proposal. From what I could tell, it's pretty much all the same and in tandem. The NATO response is bullet pointed 1 through 10 with several subpoints, and I'll get into that. The U.S. response is more written out. They basically contain the same offer, and we'll talk about it if it's actually a viable proposal. But first, I just want to mention this was leaked to the Spanish news outlet I think it's Paez. And again, it contains both. This is obviously like somebody took pictures of the document, so at times it could be a little bit, tricky or blurry to read, especially with the watermark in the background. But if you want, this document is available, and the Pentagon did confirm that it is the official document. Now, it is interesting that this was leaked after the U.S. demanded it be kept private, and just the handling of it by the U.S. government, I think it was leaked by somebody in the West. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who leaked this document is pro deal getting done with Russia, and in fact, it could be an effort to undermine the document, because I do think there are things in here that is really going to upset the U.S. and NATO warhawks, and now they're going to be able to attack it a little bit more. But at the same time, it could have just been an official U.S. government leak as well to say, look, this is what we're offering Russia and Putin. Why won't they accept it? Because it's not exactly clear if this is going to be enough to really diffuse tensions, at least in my view. So going through the NATO one, just because it's bullet pointed 1 through 10, it's a little bit easier to post it up, and if people want to follow along or whatever, they can. Point 1 basically is all propaganda. NATO is a defensive alliance and poses no threat to Russia. We have always striven for peace, stability, and security in the Euro-Atlantic area, and a Europe whole, free, and at peace. This remains our goal and our abiding vision. And, this is a nice propaganda slogan and everything, but NATO isn't a defensive alliance. It only fights offensive wars, whether, that's Kosovo, Afghanistan, or Libya. Anytime NATO's been used, it's been used offensively. Also, the bigger problem with NATO, though, isn't these, by world standards, minor wars. Not that it's minor to Libya, Afghanistan. Of course, this have huge repercussions, and we're talking about millions and millions of lives and everything. But we also aren't talking about conflict between the U.S. and Russia when we're talking about the Afghan war, and that is the main purpose of NATO. Of course, it was first meant to counter Russia or the Soviet Union, USSR, and the Warsaw Pact, and then with the Warsaw Pact being dissolved and then the USSR being dissolved, NATO expanded and expanded and expanded despite guarantees by the first H.W. Bush administration that NATO would not expand as long as Russia would allow Germany to be unified and join NATO, which it was allowed to do. And so, the U.S. doesn't hold up its end of the bargain on this. It spans several times, Poland, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania. We're talking about like Montenegro, North Macedonia, and all these rounds of NATO expansion have largely crept NATO closer to Russia's border. But in 2008, significantly, the U.S. put countries on the path to NATO membership that included Ukraine and Georgia. And these countries are, close to Russian population centers, have long borders and significant borders with Russia. And Russia felt like this was overstepping in red lines, just too much. This would be, I think, somewhat equivalent to had the United States lost the Cold War and NATO dissolved and Russia expanded the the Warsaw Pact all the way through first Western Europe, but then also included, say, Mexico or Canada. Although I would say, if we're talking about that, we would also have to mention that, then say the capital of the United States is like Austin or Dallas, Texas, or something, and not Washington D.C. because Ukraine isn't that far from Moscow. These countries are very close to major Russian cities that the Warsaw Pact, or that NATO has now moved itself up to, and absorbed all these former Warsaw Pact and former USSR country member states. And when we're talking about Ukraine and Georgia, we're talking about members of the Russian Empire, not even just things that were added after World War II or something like that. Point two in the NATO letter is, we firmly believe that tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy and not through threat of force. Later on in this point, they say that the Russian military buildup along Ukraine's border, which they failed to mention, is within Russia, but that military buildup is unprovoked and unjustified. And so, this is just completely misreading what's happening and presenting only a one-sided narrative. It seems foolish to put this in a diplomatic letter. Like, you could just leave it out if you wanted to, just say, we firmly believe that tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy, and don't say anything the hell else, because all the rest of it is just anti-Russia rhetoric. And I'm sure when the Russians are reading this, they're just like, oh God, like, how much more of this dribble do we have to read? Because obviously the U.S. pouring hundreds of millions of dollars and now, billions of dollars in aid total into Ukraine in the past 7 years after carrying out a coup there. All the other weapons that have been built up, not just in Ukraine, but across Eastern Europe and on countries that border Russia, are all provocative. And to pretend like this is a one-sided buildup, which, if it was a one-sided buildup, it would be one-sided, the West and NATO building up their forces on Russia's border, not the other way around. But there's major military buildup on the American side that just completely gets left out of both of these letters. Point three is, we remain committed to NATO's values and Russia breaks these values. I mean, again, this is just, could have been left out of the letter. It seems confusing as to why they put a few of these things in. Four, they say, a stable relationship between NATO and Russia is in our joint interest. This is just boilerplate language, all true, fine. Five, look for areas of diplomacy. This is, where we start to get into the better sounding rhetoric. Point six is just nothing. Point seven is the state of U.S.-Russian relations, and they say 7.1, making full use of the existing military-to-military channels to promote predictability, transparency, and reduce risk. Of course, this comes as throughout the Trump administration, the U.S. would intentionally fly all kinds of missions right up to Russian airspace and right along the lines there to get Russia to switch on its missile defense and systems like that, intentionally being unpredictable, untransparent, and provocative. And so a lot of this thing, and I'm sure Russia does some of the same stuff. I believe just today or yesterday, there were reports from the UK that they had to scramble fighters because of Russia flying near its airspace, and occasionally Russia will fly, I think, near typically Alaskan airspace off the US West Coast and things like that. And so, it does happen on the Russia side as well. But if we really want to address this, it has to happen on the NATO and U.S. side, probably first, because it's more aggressive and provocative that way. 7.2 is reestablishing NATO and Russia's mutual presence in Moscow and Brussels, respectively. This is a good and important step, and something that if they really wanted to highlight and focus on, could be building blocks for larger agreements and more transparency and predictability. Right now, there's very few diplomats between, Western states and Russia altogether. It's not just the U.S. and NATO, but lots of countries have reduced their diplomatic missions. But but particularly the U.S. And now a lot of the diplomat stuff that happens in Russia is just bare bones. Apparently, there were reports, and this kind of gets silly, and is, I think, in part like mainstream media narrative to humiliate Russia. But they did say that it got to the point where I think deputy ambassador or something in Moscow was learning how to buff the floors and things like that in the embassy. So 7.3, the last point here, is working on Russian proposal to establish a civilian telephone hotline to maintain emergency contact. This would be great if they had it set up. And I know there's deconfliction lines and things like that for various things between the U.S. and Russia, like over Syria. So having more of these would be productive and, again, help, stability and transparency and things like that. Now on to number 8, where they say European security, including the situation around Ukraine. Now, it's important to note that they're talking about NATO here, but they're also extending this to Ukraine. And very specifically, NATO, Ukraine isn't a part of NATO. It's not a member state, but yet they really seem to suggest that, they almost view NATO or Ukraine as a NATO state, the way they frame this. And they say, all states respecting and adhering to the principles of sovereignty, of borders and territorial integrity of states, and refraining from the threat and use of force. Now, have an interesting thing in Ukraine where in 2014, the U.S. overthrew the government for the entire state of Ukraine and input a government that it wanted. It put the prime minister it wanted in, or president wanted in charge. It put the various other actors and put them in the places they wanted to. And they use neo-Nazis to get this done. And that's allowed to happen because it doesn't change borders and adheres to territorial integrity. But Russia annexing the Crimean Peninsula, even though that move was backed by a referendum where 90, I think, percent of the people in Crimea voted that they were pro joining Russia, and that's completely unacceptable. This is just the backward logic that NATO and the U.S. frequently use. The 8.2, all states respecting the rights of other states to choose or change security arrangements and decide their own future and foreign policy free from outside interference. This is reaffirming the commitment to NATO's open door policy. And this is something that was brought up in Putin's speech and that me and Connor talked about on the last episode of the show, that it was clear from Putin's speech that the letter did not include some kind of room to negotiate on Georgia, Ukraine, and also Moldova. Gets talked about less, but also important as being potential NATO members. And that, that is something that Russia was looking apparently for, a security guarantee on it, and saying that, these states would absolutely not join NATO. Because once they join NATO, it means more U.S. training in those countries, more U.S. troops deployed in those countries, missile positions taken up in those countries, and, the threats to Russia all over their borders. And so I guess my final thoughts on this one is this is really the worst news of the U.S. and NATO responses, inflexibility on that issue, and potentially that is the issue that will, cross the red line with Russia and ultimately lead to some kind of Russian action in Ukraine. And, that is something that people are talking about, that we've talked about on this show, that I think is a possibility. Now, 8.4, I think is some good news. They say all parties engaging constructively in various conflict resolution formats, and they include the Normandy format here. And so that's I think good news, because the Normandy format refers to the 4-party German, French, Ukraine, and Russian talks on resolving the Ukrainian civil war, the conflict in the Donbass region, and those talks produced the Minsk II agreement, which gives the Donbass region of Ukraine a good amount of autonomy. And so, being on board with the Normandy format talks and being on board with the Minsk agreement, which I don't think actually was mentioned in this document, unfortunately, is it, but overall is a good sign. I think that the Europeans are looking for deconfliction in Ukraine. And then point five, they say Russian refraining from coercive force posturing, aggressive nuclear rhetoric, and malign activities directed at allies and other countries. Which, had they just taken out Russia there and say refraining from, it would have been absolutely fine. But obviously, throwing Russia in there and making it like one sided like that is pretty undiplomatic. Point nine is all about risk reduction, and here's where we get the most substantial proposals offered. Point one is they say they need to expand and do more with the Russia NATO Council. And, this is reflected in the U.S. letter as well, that there needs to be more diplomacy, that they've gone far too away from diplomacy and everything like that. They want to, 9.2 is engaging constructively on the Vienna document and modernizing it. I believe this has to do with various troop deployments throughout Europe, and it was last updated in 2011. I'm not sure what the current status of it is, but yeah. 9.3, increasing transparency of exercises and SNAP exercises by lowering notification and observation thresholds. If this applies to everybody, it's probably a good thing. Although if you look at the letter and everything, it seems that the West is really only concerned about it, applying to Russia. 9.4 is preventing dangerous incidents of military nature via increased transparency and risk reduction efforts. 9.5, holding reciprocal briefings on Russia and NATO's nuclear policies and elaborating on further potential reciprocal strategic risk reduction measures. I think this one is actually quite significant. These briefings going on in each country understanding its nuclear posture will help prevent, accidents from happening and things like that. So that's, I think, a really positive one if it happens. 9.6, consulting on ways to reduce threats to space systems, including through efforts to promote responsible behavior in space, and Russia refraining from conducting anti-satellite tests, which create large amounts of debris. So it's actually been the United States that has pushed far more than Russia, China, or any other state to militarize space up until this point. And yeah, Russia has, and I believe India and China have conducted anti-satellite tests. Yeah, those tests do produce space debris. I'm not sure if it's dangerous to the level that the U.S. government is saying, but I also don't know. It absolutely could be. That being said, this isn't a one-sided issue, and NATO states taking responsibility for when they have militarized space as well is important. The U.S. has talked about putting space-based like missile defense systems in space and things like that. And if you say you can't have an anti-space satellite, but the U.S. has satellites that are capable or intricately involved in its missile defense, then you've weaponized space, and it's completely absurd that you would then demand the other side kneecap itself and not have anti-satellite technology. Also worth mentioning, and we talked about this on the show fairly recently, that the U.S. and Israel are joint developing the Arrow 3 missile defense system, and they bill it as, oh, this is going to be good because we're going to intercept the missiles so high above the atmosphere that it will produce less debris coming down on the ground and kill less people. But if you're also intercepting things that high into orbit, you're also able to hit satellites and things like that. So this is just completely hypocritical to demand Russia act on space when we aren't. 9.7, promoting a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace by consulting on ways to reduce threats in the cyber domain, by pursuing efforts to enhance stability by adhering to international legal obligations and voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So, just a lot of the way it's state language spoken there, but saying that they want no cyber attacks against each other. Of course, the U.S. has been announced several times, is carrying out offensive cyber operations. And there was a recent cyber attack on the railways in Belarus, distinctly to prevent Russia from redeploying troops to Belarus. And so it seems like if we're looking at cyber warfare, we really have to be looking at all around. Also, this one I think is kind of difficult if you want to make it a centerpiece, just because non-state actors or any state could develop hacking abilities. And from what I've been able to understand, it's very easy to mask who you are when you're hacking and things like that. This not only came out through the Vault 7 WikiLeaks, where the CIA has the ability to hack and make it look like someone else, but other people have published this research. I don't think it would be that surprising to someone to hear. And so if you do make it central, and cyber attacks are going to happen, people are going to attack pipelines and infrastructure if they're environmentalists, right? But to blame it on each other could create real rifts in the relationship and things like that. But at the same time, having some kind of agreement, and here you could mention, since the document attacks Russia so much, like as an example of what Russia did with the Reveal group by arresting the people that carried out the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S., maybe attempting to offer an olive branch and to reward Russian behavior. Rather, you don't have that at all. 9.8, consulting on concrete ways to prevent incidents in the air and at sea with a view to rebuild trust and confidence. This would be nice, but again, so I think allowing the U.S. and NATO states to act more. 9.9, all states recommitting to the full implementation and completion and letter and spirit of the international obligations and commitments in the arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, including the Chemical Weapons Convention and Biological Weapons Convention. This, I think, was specifically put in there because there's so much rhetoric targeting Russia, claiming they carried out chemical weapons attack, whether it's against Sergei Skripal in the UK or against the Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, who, by the way, is not despite being persecuted by the Russian government, is a pretty extreme racist who has recommended using violence and comparing minorities in Russia to cockroaches. And I think it's probably, for people who find Putin to be too far right wing, I think they'll find Navalny to be far more offensive in a lot of ways. But there are those claims against Russia which I don't think are true, and throwing that in here, suggests that they're saying that against Russia. At the same time, if we're looking at things like this, we could, I think more accurately discuss like the U.S. use of white phosphorus and other weapons in like depleted uranium in the Middle East as well. 9.10, Russia resuming the implementation of the Treaty on Convention Armed Forces in Europe. I looked this thing up because I wasn't familiar with it. Russia exited this agreement, I believe, in 2007, and then NATO followed by exiting in 2015. Russia's issue with this agreement is that NATO expansion made it irrelevant, and so maybe negotiations could come to light and move this forward to incorporate the states that NATO has expanded to since the agreement was initially made in 1991. 9.11. In light of allies' concerns about Russia's state armament program, including its stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons, as well as the growing number and types of intermediate and short-range missiles and launchers, encouraging Russia to negotiate with the United States on future arms control and disarmament agreements and arrangements that encompass all U.S. Russian nuclear weapons, including non-strategic nuclear weapons, non-deployable nuclear warheads, as well as all nuclear armed intercontinental range delivery vehicles. And so this is, I think, generally talking about bringing back the INF Treaty. And they also mention in here that this is going to engage seriously with the United States on ground-based intermediate and short-range missiles and their launchers, as a part of the broader discussions, including all allies about next steps, and in the U.S. In the Russia NATO Council. So, anyways, I think that's the most significant part of the letter right there. And including the launchers means including the Patriot missile batteries that are stationed in Poland and Romania and that do violate the INF treaty. And so I think this is a real signal from NATO that they're willing to negotiate on that. So I want to talk about, and then I do have the U.S. letter here, and I'm going to scroll through that and I think bring up a couple of points from it. But generally, everything in the U.S. letter is very similar to everything in the NATO letter. It's just more written in like paragraph form rather than the bullet pointed out NATO letter. Now, I guess why this is so important, I think, and something that I hadn't considered, just my short sightedness on my analysis here, I guess, that, when they were talking about missile placements in Eastern Europe, they were talking about expanding them. I didn't think the U.S. would seriously be willing to negotiate on its current missile placements in Romania and Poland, and this has been a huge issue for Russia for several years. And so if the US is willing to remove those weapon systems, it might be enough to diffuse tensions even without an outright agreement not to bring Ukraine into NATO. So I think there is some real good news here that we're seeing. And there's a great article today by Ray McGovern at antiwar.com that I definitely recommend that everybody go check out and read for more information on this, and for more of his take. And he details it out. I think explains it a little bit better than I do. Ray is so good and has understood this issue for so long. That's why his analysis has been so important. But he is talking about that this is like a half loaf for Russia and all that. And I don't think it's necessarily the perfect deal or one that will definitely resolve this conflict, but this could be a real step in the right direction in diffusing tensions. Now, there is a lot of other things going on, and most of it does sound like bad news. The U.S. announced that they're deploying 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe. Now, this should come with a major asterisk, right? Because what they're actually doing is they're deploying 2,000 troops to Germany and Ukraine, so split 2,000 between those two countries, and then redeploying 1,000 troops from Germany to Romania. So it's just 2,000 troops. It's not even 3,000. And 2 or 3,000 troops doesn't make a difference. And so I see this as appeasing the Hots and not really bad news at all. I mean, it's bad that the U.S. is deploying more forces to Eastern Europe, and I really hope to hell that Biden doesn't plan to leave them there long term, and this isn't like a part of a permanent military buildup, because it's 2,000 now, and then it's another 2,000. Then the next time there's an issue in April, and then the year after that in December or something, and before you know it, there's an additional 15 or 20,000 American troops in Eastern Europe. But if this is, just a way to be like, hey, we're doing something, and, for everybody to have headlines that they need, that Biden is so concerned that he's sending more troops, but, that this really isn't making a difference. Same with the next story. The U.S. has deployed 6 F-15s to Estonia. And this could even be a part of more normal rotation kind of things. But at the same time, these stories are being portrayed in the media as, look how serious Biden is taking this situation. We also had the Neptune strike war games continuing to go on. Talked about these a little bit in the past, that the USS Truman, that aircraft carrier strike group, has been placed under the command of NATO and is now carrying out war games. I'm guessing this means very little for any real reason, but if anybody knows, like, it has maybe served on a ship that's come under the command of another country, I'd love to hear, like, it, if it really actually means anything, or if it's just like, a name change for the press and everything. But right now, the Truman is in the Adriatic Sea and carrying out war games, and so this isn't the kind of things that you would be doing if you were really committed to looking for a diplomatic solution. However, U.S. politics and the world empire being what it is, the fact that Biden made or maybe making the calculation, with some of these like war games and minor troop deployments and things like that, that it's taking the lowest and appeasing option and to avoid conflict and having, Hots have more ammunition and things to not actually use against you, because I'm pro peace and I think that you could sell that and win with that. But again, in the context of US politics, that could be what Biden's doing here. So we also have Ukraine getting some more weapons, this time from Poland. They're going to be sending their Grom man pads and then unnamed drones and ammo. I'm guessing they're not, like major Reaper drones or anything like that, but rather maybe surveillance drones or what they call suicide drones, which are just kind of little missiles or rockets that could fly around and hover a little bit and then, go and explode in on their target. I'm not sure. Again, these weapons probably wouldn't do very much in light of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, if the Ukrainians were looking to, say, try to push the issue a little bit in the Donbass region or something, maybe these weapons could make a little bit of a difference there. The president of Ukraine announced that he will increase the size of his military by 100,000 troops over the next 3 years. The current size of the Ukrainian military is 250,000. There's a lot of conscripts there. Recently, a conscript shot 4 other soldiers. I did see that the former heavyweight champion boxer, I think you pronounce his name Klitschko, was signing up for the military, or at least for like the reserve, like emergency civilian defense force kind of thing. And Zelensky did make sure when he was making these statements that it's not because he's concerned about imminent war with Russia, but rather just long term that Ukraine needed more forces. This next story from the Wall Street Journal: Ukraine missile development programs are challenging for Moscow. And I'm not sure how much of this may be a little bit of propaganda trying to like insert into the American narrative that, oh no, they say it's a foregone conclusion that Russia will just roll right in, but we could really put up a fight in Ukraine or something like that. They got these fancy new Neptune cruise missiles that could blow up ships, and really that these cruise missiles just have absolutely no capabilities. Or it could be that Ukraine is working and developing real capabilities with their missile program here. It could be coming with real help from the West, and it could end up being a real issue for Russia. As they say in this article, Kiev has revived a defense industry that once churned out advanced weapons for the Soviet Union, and is now working on a series of missiles that including one that could travel up to 600 miles to hit its target, potentially putting Moscow within range of a Ukrainian strike. Excuse me for butchering that sentence. Potentially putting Moscow within range of a Ukrainian strike. And so, this I think would be seen by Russia as a real threat if their intelligence does, view the Ukrainian missile program not as just Western propaganda, but as a real program. And to go on with that, likely I think Russia would see it as a threat, even if they do assess it to somewhat just be propaganda, because this is the case with the Patriot missiles and the U.S. missile defense programs that Putin initially brought up. And, it was said to him that, look, this is just a military industrial complex boondoggle. And Putin said, yeah, but it's, putting the first strike capabilities and the nuclear balance between the U.S. and Russia way off balance. And, this is a real problem. So for all the good news that I already talked about on the INF treaty and potentially renegotiating that. That, by the way, is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers we're talking about here. And we have this from the Politico National Security Daily Newsletter. Japan is potentially open to hosting once banned America intermediate range missiles pending the results of a defense policy review per the country's ambassador to the United States. And so Japan considering putting these missiles in its country is fairly important, and if that happened, I would think that would be a step backwards on the diplomacy over Ukraine if the US is putting these banned missiles on the other side of Russia. Of course, this may, I think, primarily be directed at and thought about in the context of China, but I think it would be an issue for Russia as well. All right. Last up here on the bad news stuff is U.S. threatens Russia with a chip blockade, and that is semiconductors. The U.S. is looking at making it illegal and sanctioning anyone who exports in any way U.S. equipment, tools, software, or designs that are involved with semiconductors to Russia. Now, I'm not sure how true it is that the U.S. could really cut off the flow of semiconductors to Russia, how much it would impact the Russian economy if they did. But I think that there may be some within the U.S. government, or at least the U.S. blob, that think they have a little bit of a trump card with the sanctions on the chips issue, and I'm not quite sure that is the case. One reason being that, even if the U.S. did sanction Russia over this, it's not clear that China would go along with it. And if China did and just exported Chinese semiconductors to Russia, that may kind of balance out and alleviate Russia's problem. Also, Russia has for a long time been talking about that they're worried about sanctions and trying to sanction-proof their economy. So my guess is that they do probably have some plans for what they would do. Also want to mention that this USAID announcement that they put out, U.S. government joins a multi-donor coalition to launch new partnership fund for Resilient Ukraine. And Resilient Ukraine, I believe, is the name of the fund and program that is going to distribute aid to regions and communities of eastern Ukraine. It's not exactly clear what that aid is. Of course, the USAID in the past has been used as a CIA cutout, and so maybe this is a way for the CIA, I think it's called Ground Branch, to carry out its operations in Ukraine, covertly bringing in millions of dollars through this USAID program and then giving those weapons to militants or something like that.